welcome to part 2 of our Research Connections panel, where we're going to discuss scholarship in the public interest. I should start by first saying what I'm not. I'm clearly not Danielle Coleman. I'm Allison McQueen, Professor of Art History in the Department of History. Danielle is temporarily under the weather and unable to be with us this morning. My experience with community partners involves many arts organizations, and most recently I curated an exhibition with students in a seminar on the history of collecting, for which we focused on artworks in the city of Hamilton's corporate collection. This is a product of a collaboration that began 2 years ago and speaks to many of the issues that the first panel this morning talked about, particularly in conjunction with trust and privileged relationships and serendipity. I was given very privileged access to the city of Hamilton's storage vaults 2 years ago, and students in the History of Collecting seminar started to mount the exhibition in January, and you can see it on the second floor on display right now in MIP. So I invite you over lunch, if you like, to take the only museum I know that will, non-museum space I know that will allow you to take food and look at art. You can go to the second floor of the atrium over your lunch break and see the application of our research in partnership with the city. Over half of the works came out of storage, and the research on our labels and catalog has helped the city of Hamilton better understand the aesthetic, historical, and contemporary relevance of its collection. So it's a different kind of application of knowledge in the community, as we've been discussing. First on our agenda for our second panel is Elzbieta Grodek with her community partner, Christine Rees. Elzbieta is an assistant professor in our Department of French who researches the 20th and 21st century French novel and also has an interest in the methodologies of teaching French. Christine Rees has been a French language teacher for 28 years, and in her current role as a French as a second language consultant at the Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board, she works with schools and teachers in the area of curriculum and assessment. I invite the two of them to begin their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. It's a pleasure to be here with Christine Rees, and we thank you, the organizers, for inviting us. So I would invite you to mentally move now into the context of teaching and learning, because that is the collaboration that we are trying to develop with the Hamilton Board of Education. I will talk about some general ideas around this project, and then Christine will go into more of details about this collaboration. So the project that we are working on together, and we hope we see it as the beginning of a further collaboration, is related to a level 4 course that will be offered by the Department of French in September 2013. The course is called Teaching French as a Second Language from Theory to Practice. And we just ran from January to April with the collaboration of Christine and her institution, feasibility study for this course. So we are really at the rather preliminary stage of our collaboration. The rationale for the course is related to a rather worrying situation of new French teachers in Ontario. The last edition of a document, Transition to Teaching, which is published regularly, annually by the Ontario College of Teachers, shows some worrying statistics. Since 2007, a lot of new French teachers in Ontario are unemployed or underemployed. And the very concrete statistics that I have, which relates to French as a second language teachers, are 32% of them have regular positions, 16% are unemployed and 28% underemployed. And the statistics are even worse for teachers in French programs such as immersion or French schools. So my initial idea was to, because in the French department, some part of our students who specialized in French want to pursue a career in education, my idea was to create something that would get them a better start and a better position in this competition on the labor market. But not only on the labor market, but even beforehand, because teachers' colleges in Ontario have reacted to this situation, and they decreased the number of seats from around above 5,000 to above 4,000. That's a big difference. So I wanted to give our students something that would put them in a better position. So as you see, this knowledge mobilization, I must confess, it wasn't really mobilizing our knowledge, especially because I'm not an educational researcher, although I am interested in teaching French, as we all teach French in the department, language. It was rather asking for people who are on the ground, who know the practice, to come join us and participate in the organization of this course. At the same time, when doing this project, I realized that this linear movement, inside out, our knowledge outside or outside in, is not, of course, the only way of doing things. And I realized that the interaction model was working very well in this context. And this kind of circulation of meanings, because we often use, as we know, the same words, but we don't always mean, we don't always have the same conceptual reference, and that exactly may be the case with this movement from rather theoretical approaches in academia to practical behavior in the real profession. I maybe say a few words about methodological grounds. We used the David Kolb's experiential learning ideas, which just are not new to McMaster, because they are used very successfully by our colleagues in social sciences. This experiential model of Kolb is related to a kind of circular learning. So experience doesn't mean here seminars in classroom and then internship or practicum outside in a kind of rather loosely related manner. The Kolb's model starts by what he calls concrete experience, then reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. So we do, and you can join this circle at any time. So the idea of the course was some theoretical work about teaching French as a second language methodologies done in seminars with me, then practical observations in the classrooms, related also with discussions with teachers, and then students would bring back this experience, and we would rediscuss this within the seminar and so on. So this is kind of a spiral movement going again by the same places, but hopefully with a somehow enriched experience. And the reflective part is extremely important for us. We want students to get to this meta level of reflection about their behavior, their learning behavior, and their attitudes in the classroom. Another aspect that we wanted to bring in is Michael Polanyi's ideas about tacit knowledge, as well as the idea of soft skills, life skills that I think we are very well located in the humanities to think more about that and to try to find a way to learn this part of professional behavior that is extremely important for successful career. So for that, I'm looking at what is called DISCO, which is European Dictionary of Skills and Competences, and this is a structure, kind of vocabulary that provides classifications of skills and competences that are looked for in different professions. And we would like to maybe organize this course in not at all a linear way, rather in a form of learning objects which are organized around some ideas or skills, and this learning object can be moved around and reconfigured from one year to another in relation of the labor market demand and new development in research around teaching French as a second language methodology and underlying linguistics concepts and theories. The last thing that I would like to say, and that was kind of very, very nice surprise for me, it was this interactive model of collaboration. We had different agents. We started with Christine and the Board of Education, but we wanted also to empower students, particularly during this feasibility studies, and we asked students to actively participate in the creation of this course from their point of view. And instead of final exams and dissertations, we asked them to submit portfolios with recommendations as to how organize the final version of this course in September. Teachers were extremely enthusiastic and they formed some kind of very personal relationship with students who were in schools and are helping them. Now, for example, I have a student who is working on a research project, and the teacher that she worked with is now giving her bibliography, lending books, and recently I talked to Peter Cockett from the School of the Arts, and I'm very pleased because he agreed to offer maybe 2 workshops to our students about actors' techniques of delivery. Because I think there is a lot of acting in teaching as well, especially with the shortening attention span of our students. We need to invent something to capture their attention and hold it. And so I asked Peter if he would participate, and he says yes, that's something that I had in mind for a long time. So I'm looking at this course as this kind of groups, clusters of different approaches, behaviors that we could put together to offer our students this kind of preparation to hopefully be better on this very competitive labor market. Christine, I have no words. You know, we didn't know each other before, so it isn't a collaboration that is developing from a previous friendship. I met Christine when I was looking for contacts in the board.
A year ago.
A year ago, yes, and she is she's extremely just influential in organizing all that. And I can only say that I totally agree with one of the previous speakers when he said that it takes time. Good collaborations take time, and sometimes we are pressed to have immediate results. Like, what are you doing? Why is it taking so long? And all that. So of course we can. I have a husband who works in industry, and that's a little bit, this approach that there is a deadline. You have to just release a product, right? And then we are going to do callbacks. Is it the word? Yes, if it's needed. So I work differently, and I would rather prefer to have some more time to organize something that would get a reputation and catch our students' attention. Christine.
Well, it has been a really wonderful relationship for both of us, and it's been reciprocal in terms of our learning and our getting along. It's been nice. I just want to say that I am a McMaster graduate, but from physical education, which is now, I believe, kinesiology. So it's nice to kind of be back. Just a little bit about our school board. I am from the Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board, which is the public board. We have just under 50,000 students with almost 98 elementary schools and 18 secondary schools. We offer, so our project is with French learning. So we have 2 French as a second language learning programs, 1 French immersion, which starts in grade 1, where students learn all of their subjects in French as well as learning the language. Then we also have core French, which is simply the subject of French, and that starts in grade 4, just that little bit of background. As we just mentioned, we just met a year ago in my superintendent's office with a request from McMaster to pursue this idea of this project. I was very much interested. I'll take any opportunity to do what I can to help teachers improve student success in learning the second language. And that's where the serendipity, I think, comes up. It was by chance and my interest that this really has worked out. The other thing about timing is that French is a second language learning here in the province of Ontario, and I think across Canada as well, from my colleagues across the country, I've learned, is really in a time of shift. The provincial and federal government have been putting considerable amounts of money to school boards, specifically for French as a second language learning. And some of the requirements, some of the data, let's say, that they're looking at is to increase functional language of our students. We can talk the day about what functional language is. And also to have students continue with French right through to the end of secondary school. So we're trying to look at those 2 areas as our measures of improvement in our learning. But the other thing that's been happening is, in terms of that functional language, where we're starting to define and to look at what are our students coming out with, what are they able to do in the language, what have we been teaching, how have we been teaching in the past that's not produced that? Why is it that people will take French for 6 years, if they go from grade 4 to grade 9, and they still can't function at all in the language? So we've had to do a lot of reflection in terms of what and how we're teaching. And one of the things that we've taken on is the Common European Framework of Reference, which is a language continuum of learning, as well as looking at strategies of instruction and looking at our practice. So this opportunity to work with McMaster students who are interested in teaching, to take a look at instructional approaches that have existed in our field for many years. So we've looked at them historically, whether it's the grammar approach, the neuro-linguistic approach, and all of those, and now the action-oriented approach, how they are reflected in the classroom, and how then they relate to that student's success later on. And again, it's about, and I mentioned this earlier, it's about that gap that exists between the two institutions. And we started talking about this earlier. We don't want to exist in silos. We don't want our French teachers, whether it's through pre-service at Teachers College or at the universities, to have only this theoretical understanding of instruction of second language learning without realizing the reality that exists in the classroom. So there is that huge gap between those two. And hopefully a project like this and a course like this will help build that bridge across that gap, not to discourage our new teachers, but to help them really see what's happening. So through this funding that we're able to receive through the Ministry of Education, the federal and provincial governments, we're in a situation now where a lot of our learning for teachers is embedded in our instruction, our everyday instruction. So we tend not to have big workshop sessions where they come to listen and go back and have to implement. We use the collaborative inquiry model where we're together learners at the table. We investigate instructional strategies and approaches, try them out, do observation, come back, reflect on it, go back again to the classroom. So it's really a building. The McMaster students that participated in the pilot course this year were able to take part in those pilot projects. They were also able to go into classrooms on a regular basis and observe the instruction. And keep in mind that they're probably observing instruction that the teacher may not be able to identify as those approaches that they learned in their seminar, or may not be able to justify or explain, oh, I chose this approach with this group and I chose this approach for this day. We often, unfortunately, leave our theory and our learning behind when we get into the classroom and we just manage. So it's allowed our teachers to do some self-reflection on their own teaching practice, to think about what approaches they are using once they start to get in the conversation with their students. So the timing was excellent in terms of our relationship and our opportunity, but also in terms of what's happening with second language learning in Ontario today. I think that's about it. So, I mean, like I said, we're going to continue with the project next year, hoping to have more students as well as more classrooms to visit. And hopefully, I mean, the bottom line for our board is improving student achievement. And we do that through our own practice in our classrooms and so on. So this has been a real positive thing for our teachers so far, and I hope it continues.
Thank you very much, Christine. Our next presentation is from Faiza, Hirji, and Danielle Wong. Faiza is an assistant professor of communication studies, exploring media representations of race, religion, ethnicity, and gender, media and identity formation, and uses of media in diaspora. She volunteers within the Ismaili Muslim community and is currently a member of the Aga Khan Council for Canada. Faiza's PhD student, Danielle Wong, has an academic and professional background in journalism. Her research interests include Asian North American identities, productions and performances in social media. Danielle will be presenting her research on Linsanity, related to Jeremy Lin as sports phenomenon, and Austin Clark's The Meeting Point at conferences this spring and summer. I invite them to tell us more about their research connections.
Thank you. Well, during the break, Danielle and I were talking about the fact that we're not quite sure if we're well placed. I see the description of the panel as that there's emphasis on more traditional methods of knowledge mobilization. I'm not sure if that's correct for the two of us or not. I must say I can't actually take credit for Danielle's work, though I would love to. I do sit on her committee, but she is not my student, strictly speaking, though she is going to participate on one of my research projects. So I will talk about that. So I'm going to depart a little bit from the format. I hope that's okay. I think there's different ways in which my work does engage in knowledge mobilization. And so rather than trying to narrow it down to one, I thought I would talk briefly about the different ways. So I hope that's all right. And I think Danielle will be doing something similar. So the first way, perhaps obviously based on the description of my work, is that I do research on the community of which I'm a member. So I do research on second generation South Asian youth, so Canadian youth of South Asian origin. And so much of that is reflected in a book that I published in 2010, where I looked at the ways in which these youth use media in the construction of identity. And so I brought a lot of that work back into the classroom because I find that really a lot of what you can say about that community is very applicable to many second generation immigrant youth that we found in our classrooms today. And I think some of that also touches on Danielle's work as well. So that's one way. Another way is a research project that I'm currently working on, and so Danielle is serving as a research assistant on that one, where we're looking at media representations of Islam, so specifically Muslim women, but trying to do it a little bit differently. So there is a growing body of research, it's still relatively small, but a growing body of research that looks at media representation of Islam. And in particular, there is a lot of emphasis on Muslim women, but we're trying with this project not just to look at this lens of where are the misperceptions and what are the negative stereotypes, but also what are some of the successes. So where do we find some nuanced representations, and where we find them, what are the factors that contribute to that? So what is it that journalists might be doing differently? And I'll mention here, by the way, that Danielle is a former journalist with a lot of experience talking about, not necessarily all positive perhaps, but diversity in the newsroom. So what are the factors that contribute to these more nuanced representations? And I'll just call them that because I don't think we can necessarily always say that they're positive or negative. But we have seen some shifts over the years. So for instance, CTV has a diversity panel, or I can't remember if it's called a multiculturalism panel. The Globe and Mail has had CARICAN, so the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Canadian chapter, come in and do workshops with them to try and educate them about the types of language that they perhaps would be better off employing rather than using terms like Islamic terrorism, for instance. So we've seen some changes. Some of it might be superficial, some of it perhaps is more meaningful, but it has been triggered by this collaboration, I think, at times between community groups and media outlets, and then sometimes academics and research organizations as well. So with this research project, we're looking not just at analyzing media representation, so we're still doing that, so looking specifically at television depictions in the press, but then also going out and speaking to some of these media producers, and this is some of the work that Danielle will be doing with me, speaking to the media producers and speaking to the community organizations like CARICAN to get a sense of what is the work that's being done to address some of these questions. And they are questions that preoccupy, I think, many people in these rooms. So what is it that we could be doing better? Because these are issues now that are having very significant effects on Muslim communities in Canada and people who live alongside Muslim communities in Canada, and are trying to make sense of things that are happening in the world, and sometimes the media are their only avenue of getting that information. So that's one way, I think, in which we can say there's some knowledge mobilization that's taking place, and that hopefully would have a twofold effect. So one is that for academic purposes, it would be possible to then identify what some of the factors are in creating more nuanced representation. So rather than always trying to figure out what's wrong with the media representations, how can we create better ones? And then filtering that information then back to community organizations and back to media producers that perhaps would like to have a little bit more analysis on how this might work. And I think in many cases there is interest in understanding better how this might occur, but sometimes people don't necessarily know how to make this happen. And sometimes the efforts that are made are well-intended, but not necessarily informed by a lot of in-depth research, I might say. So that's another way in which my work engages with knowledge mobilization. And the other way, which is maybe a little bit different than some of the forms we've talked about so far, but that Alison mentioned in my biography, is that over perhaps I'd say the last 8 years or so, I've been doing some community work that is different from what I've talked about, but very strongly related. And as with many or perhaps all of my research projects, my identity does play a role in this. So I am an Ismaili Muslim. I volunteer very actively in that community. There are about 100,000 Ismaili Muslims in Canada, and we actually have an entire social governance structure that is set up, and this is run almost entirely by volunteers. So I would say that we have a national council, which is the Aga Khan Council for Canada, and then that is mirrored by 6 local councils. I would say I'm estimating we have perhaps 30 to 40 staff across the country. The rest of it is entirely volunteer-based. So using thousands of volunteers across the country, all working in different roles. My specific case is that I currently work as volunteer as one of the two communications coordinators for the National Council. And the Anglophone Council of Canada is a national voluntary body that oversees different aspects of social governance for the community. So we sometimes say we're almost like a miniature government. We have portfolios for education, for health, for women's development, for economic planning. We have sister institutions that oversee dispute resolution and humanitarian assistance in developing countries. We're loosely affiliated with a few other institutions, also established by the Aga Khan, although not voluntary institutions in those cases. So the Aga Khan Foundation, which carries out international development work, and which is currently fundraising across Canada through its annual World Partnership Walk, which you may have heard of, and that is headquartered in Ottawa. The Global Centre for Pluralism, which is a think tank established in partnership between the Aga Khan Development Network and the Government of Canada, also headquartered in Ottawa. And the Aga Khan Museum, which is set to open in Toronto in 2014 and will be the first museum in North America devoted to showcasing Islamic arts and cultures. So again, coming back to these goals of educating about Islam and perceptions of Islam and Islamic civilizations. So those of us who serve as volunteers in this organization support the work of all of these institutions, as well as carrying out what I might call more sort of internal work for the council. So I've worked locally on issues of women's equity and promoting education. In my current role, I oversee a number of areas related to communication. So Brady spoke earlier about what it is that communication studies grads do, and so I do all of that and then some other things. Some of it's very standard promotion of our own programming. So we do a number of different programs aimed at improving the quality of life for the community. We also produce a weekly newsletter in all 6 regions, as well as a national magazine twice a year. And I've used this forum to talk about some of my research. So we've done issues on identity. We're actually doing an upcoming issue on the role of technology in building community. We oversee most aspects of external relations, so that means relationships with politicians, with other Muslims, community organizations, funding partners. So for instance, we have health partnerships. We have partnerships with universities to run tutoring programs for youth who are underperforming. And all of this is moderated to some extent by the communication coordinators. So there are 2 of us nationally, and then there are 6 locally as well who support us. And the role of communication, I'm sure this is not just true of our own institution, but the role of communication has become more pressing than ever as we become more, I guess I would say, externally facing as a community. So with projects like the Aga Khan Museum, but also with the world changing so much around us. So the media perceptions of Islam come back directly then to the community internally. So we've seen the ways in which this continuous media coverage that questions citizenship and identity and belonging has really had an impact now within our community as well. But then there are also ways that are not necessarily related to identity. So for instance, some of the things we do now are develop modules on the ethics of social media, because we find that the issues inside the community are the same as the issues outside the community, that people are using technology, but they don't necessarily know what the consequences are. So those are some other ways as well. Some of the other ways in which we try to find opportunities to emphasize education about Islam involve a building that we have in the Greater Vancouver area, which will be joined shortly by one in Toronto, so called the Ismaili Center. We have 6 of these globally, which house prayer halls, but also house spaces that we use for dialogue activities and for external relations. So there will be one opening in Toronto adjacent to the Aga Khan Museum later this year. And we use this, we've used this in the past. So in Vancouver, we've had Karen Armstrong come and speak as part of her 12 Days of Compassion tour, and she spoke about misunderstanding about Islam. We've also hosted the Governor General. We've hosted Stephen Tuke, the president of UBC, speaking on pluralism and action at universities. We've hosted diplomats from various countries, such as Afghanistan, because we do a lot of work there. So in this position, I don't know if this is traditional knowledge mobilization, but I would say that a lot of the work I do at the university and a lot of my research informs what I do in my volunteer work, and then a lot of it also informs what I do in the classroom as well. So I do traditional communication functions, so things like writing and editing speeches, newsletter inserts, press releases, strategy papers, all of that. I'm also managing director of the publication arm of the Council for Canada, so I'm responsible for the publication of the magazine as well as feeding into our international website. I also address other matters that relate to external relations or communications. But all of this, I think, comes into having a better understanding of what the issues are, largely in terms of, what are the ways in which communication practice is changing in the country and around the world. What are the ways in which it affects the specific community with which I do research? And then what are some of the ways that this then comes back into the classroom? And I think there are many ways. So for instance, the research that we do around things like social governance and education and women's issues, and how we communicate around that. Catherine made reference to that earlier, the challenges of working with different groups and wanting to affect change, but then at the same time needing to understand what the nuances are of that group too. I think all of this makes an impact when I come back to the classroom and I see some of the same questions being reflected, not necessarily with Muslim groups or South Asian groups or Central Asian groups, but just generally, depending on the diversity of your classroom and depending on what the issues are of the day. So I think these are some of the ways in which I get to see the direct impact of having a communications background, but then also feed that back into some of my research and sometimes raising research questions that I bring into the projects that I do. So again, I'm not sure if that fits under traditional knowledge mobilization, but that is some of the work that I'm doing right now.
Thanks so much. Well, I don't know if I'm still in the process of learning, so I'm very much privileged to be here on this panel to learn from other people on this panel. I've just wrapped up my first year of my PhD, so I'm really excited to embark on my actual project and to learn it here. And I also haven't started my portion of Faiza's project yet, but I'm really excited based on what I know from her and from what we've been talking about so far. I guess I'll talk in two sections about how we can relate to knowledge mobilization and the partnership between me and Faiza, but mainly I'll talk first about my journalism background and how that intersects, or I see it intersecting, or bringing up questions around research now that I'm in grad studies. But I was a reporter with the Hamilton Spectator for just over 3 years, and prior to that, as I was doing journalism school and shortly after, I've been in a couple of newspapers as a reporter in Ontario for shorter contracts. And I guess the personal investment in Faiza's work is important to me. When I was at a newspaper in Toronto, and I won't name which one, but I was at a larger newspaper in Toronto. Shortly after graduating from journalism school, I was asked to cover the Uyghur population in Toronto, which is not of my ethnicity, but they are a people group that see themselves as sovereign, claim sovereignty within China. And so would not identify necessarily as Chinese. And I was asked to cover a protest in which a Uyghur group in Toronto were protesting downtown, and I had been asked because the editor asked me, "Do you know who the Uyghurs are?" I'm like, "Yes," and I thought he wanted just information on the background, so I tried to provide some cultural background and explain why that's not my ethnic group. And he said, "Well, you're the only one in this newsroom who knows what a Uyghur is, so we're sending you, and you're Chinese, so you're going." And as a young reporter, as an intern, and the only female reporter in this highly coveted internship program, I went and had water bottles thrown at me and people assuming that I was a Chinese spy. It was not fun. And probably the story itself would have benefited more from someone who did not identify as Chinese or did not look like me. So a lot of the experience is coming from the newsroom and just well-intentioned, I think, people and journalists themselves who know the importance of accurate coverage or fair coverage, and yet maybe might not have the existing partnerships or structures to begin that kind of dialogue. It's something that was on my heart and on my mind when I moved to full-time grad studies, and this opportunity sounds really exciting as we embark on that. Yeah, just to add on to Faiza's comments about, I'm not sure how traditional research mobilization would look like under my project, and I'm really just starting out. But sort of my research interests come around alternative ways of communicating, and maybe what's what has been alternative and is becoming quite mainstream in terms of representations of race and imagined or constructions or performances of certain identities or communities, particularly Asian North American communities, through social media. So I'm particularly interested in YouTube, Twitter, microblogs, traditional blogs, and just the intersections between and the interactivity between those sorts of Web 2.0 platforms, and how we can discuss them, and also speak with people who are producing and even making a living off of these very particular types of performances. And in terms of racial representations and stereotyping, that becomes a large question as well around whether certain stereotypes continue to be perpetuated, if they're self-performed, or are they being questioned in their exposures, and how users of social media, their uses of these productions and performances and their interaction with trouble traditional stereotypes or exasperate it or reaffirm. So that's at the heart of my question, my research interest around that. And I think speak to, and it really comes out of just, I guess, an academic background and some years in journalism that have prompted questions about how we communicate with communities, who we identify as a community and what defines a community. And when we're looking for voices for journalism as research or as research in academia, who gets to be a voice, and what are the politics involved with when someone is a representative voice for a community, and whether that can be something that we leave untroubled. And I think those questions also speak to Faiza's work. So that's my addition to your comments.
Thank you very much, Faiza and Danielle. Now we're going to reflect on how academic scholarship in the form of a published book, whatever its electronic or physical form, extends knowledge to communities beyond traditional scholarly communities. We're going to hear from Viv Nelles, who is Professor of History and Director of the Wilson Institute and the L.R. Wilson Chair in Canadian History. Viv has published on a wide range of subjects and is the winner of the Tyrrell Medal for Historical Scholarship and a two-time recipient, bless you, of the Sir John A. Macdonald Prize in Canadian History. We've got that on record, Colin. Viv has brought Jennie Rubio from Oxford University Press. Jennie is the trade editor there and manages their publishing program that presents specialized knowledge in book form to a wider public. Oxford University Press is the publisher of Viv's book, A Little History of Canada. I invite them to tell us their story.
Thank you very much. I don't really know what knowledge mobilization is, but if it's enriching our community, as the title suggests, the Wilson Institute at McMaster University has had a fair bit of experience with projects, various kinds of projects of enriching the community, from the People of the Bay, which we started out with a video which went into the schools, to the one which I'd like to underline again today, the show, the art show on the second floor, which Alison and her curated with her students. I hope everybody goes and sees it. This is a project of outreach which brings together partners from the community, and the Wilson Institute has been able to provide the funds necessary for the lovely catalog, but also has been able to provide funds for the cleaning up of one of the key pictures which appears in that show. So the Wilson Institute is an example, I think, in the Faculty of Humanities of an ongoing relationship between the university and various communities. Now, it's not that Bonnie wanted me to talk about, it's this little book, which he seems quite infatuated with. I expect to, it's the cover that did it, right? In its second edition. I'm an academic, perhaps like many of you. I write big, boring books and articles that even my family find a little hard to read. This is the sort of thing that we do in our day job. But I think behind Bonnie's invitation to me is the question is, how do you get from that day job into the kind of package like this? How do you get yourself, and I mean that psychologically as much as in a career way, how do you get into the position of being able to communicate to a wider audience? And I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about that today in a practical way of how I work my way into this package. And Jennie will talk more generally about the process of once people have ideas, how does the publisher respond? How does a publisher take these academic ideas and move them forward? So we're back in quill pen and buggy whip phases here. We're talking books, not blogs, not classroom things, not digital music files, but books. And so for those of you who aren't interested in such things as that, you can just perhaps turn off. How did I get myself into this situation? The answer is the publisher came to me. And I think that's the first thing that I'd like to say to those of you who are interested in this process. Talk to your publisher and ask her what she wishes you were writing. Because it may not have been that last big fat monograph, but there may be something that you know or some skill that you have which they want you to take to a wider public. So that's the first thing. The publisher came to me. But the publisher not only came to me with a request, it came to me with two very important bits of information. Information about my audience and information about the model that I could use to get to that audience. And I don't want to go into any detail here, but Oxford has a global imprint called A Very Short Introductions To. If you've been in an airport and you're on the way to Japan and you want to know about pottery, well, you get the very short introduction to Japanese pottery. Or if you're going off to Southeast Asia, the very short introduction to esoteric Buddhism will probably be the kind of thing that keeps you going on the airplane. Well, that was the model that they gave, the audience and the model that they gave me. And I think that's very important to have those things in your mind. What am I doing? Because I'm not doing what I was doing before. I'm doing something quite different. So the model, a very short introduction, and the audience, and here's key, international. You're not speaking to your students, your colleagues, your professional peers. You're speaking to a world well beyond that. And so you have to take, from the publisher, I got a very clear sense of the intended audience, the people that I was to reach. And indeed, let me go back to the airplane metaphor. I thought of those people as sitting in airplanes. They've got 8 hours. They want to know about Buddhism. They want to know about pottery. Some of them even want to know about Canadian history if they're on those planes coming to Canada. And that was what Oxford was trying to reach out to that group of people. Now, and to provide a Canadian contribution to the global imprint. Now the question is, why would I do such a thing as that? And I come back to the question Virginia asked about serendipity. Why would you say yes? The publisher comes to you and says, I want you to write a book that will get to a broader audience and convey some important information which we think that broader audience needs. Why would you say yes? Well, in my case, I had 3 books underway, happily all of them now finished. But there are lots of other things to do with my hands. Why would I do this? For personal and professional reasons. Personal. In every academic career, there comes a time when you have to explain yourself to your grandmother, to your mother, your aunt. Those people ask, what is it you do? Which in a sense that they're saying is, what do you know? So there was the personal sense that you have an obligation to explain yourself in a broader way than, oh, I write academic monographs, or I write articles in the scholarly journals. So that's the first thing. Secondly, professionally, my discipline, history, still is one of the disciplines in the university which does speak outside of the university. We don't just write books for ourselves, although it tends to be that way, but we imagine that there's a general audience out there for history, and that we can, if we contrive it correctly, we can actually reach them. So for personal and professional reasons, I said yes rather than no when Oxford came. It was a challenge. And now let me just, in a very brief moment, talk to you a little bit about the challenge to me as a writer in trying to do something like this. Because Oxford was very clear. They weren't going to publish one of my big fat books. Okay, they were going to publish 50, 60,000 words, and that's it. So I had to take whatever it was that I knew, or whatever it was that I thought about Canadian history, and squeeze it into this package, which had been, in a sense, predetermined. Well, first of all, my contribution, if I could just sort of focus now on the writing part, is to think very clearly about architecture. Before I thought about content, I thought about architecture, and adopted a very straightforward architectural form of from to. From this to that, and built the book around transitions. So that becomes the kind of framework within which I structured the book. The second thing that I brought to this was a method of writing which was completely different than anything I had done before. First of all, I took no notes. I didn't have a framework that I was working from. I didn't have a huge pile of research data. I did something very, very, very unusual. On June the 1st, I think 2003, I sat down at my computer and I wrote a page. And that afternoon, I then looked up in my library to see whether I could live with that page. And so in a sense, that's how I worked. Wrote in the morning, read in the afternoon. And I emphasize this not because it's sort of idiosyncratic, but rather it allowed me to keep a kind of conversational tone in my writing. I wrote before I thought about loading it up with stuff, all those qualifiers and things that we normally pack into the prose. So in a sense, I got up in the morning and I said very clearly, to myself at least, what I thought about that, whatever it was, chunk of material for that day. And then in the afternoon, I checked it to see whether I could live with it. And then a page a day. By September the 1st, manuscript complete. 3 months, you can do it. And indeed, I would emphasize this, keeping the project within a very short span of time, keeping it conversational, keeping it focused on your architecture. Now, to come to the conclusion, what happens to the manuscript? Well, that's where Jennie comes in. She wasn't there at the time, and she doesn't have to defend her publisher in this respect, but the audience that I thought, all those people in airplanes and around the world, isn't the audience that they then decided it was for. The format, very short introduction to Canada, isn't the format that they decided to go with. They decided that I produced a trade book for the Canadian audience, of all things. And that is, in fact, the audience for which it is primarily intended. So there are all sorts of funny little things that happen on the way to the mass market. There's no way of predicting how these things are going to work out. But I will emphasize that when we try to do these things, we should give up those academic habits that we have, that first of all, being guarded, protected against criticism, loading everything up with stuff. I took out all the names. My students in Japan once said to me, Canadian history is so difficult, it's got so many names in it. So this book focuses almost entirely on concepts, on ideas. So we have to sort of refocus our thinking if we want to get to that audience. And indeed, I think I would say we need to pay a lot more attention to what our publishers tell us, don't we, Jennie?
Indeed we do. So I'm glad to be here. I'm also a graduate of McMaster University, by the way, but as you know, now I'm with Oxford. And this book, as Professor Nelles said, it's got a common ancestor with some other books we do, the very short introduction series. And I guess for Oxford, that is a kind of knowledge mobilization approach to getting what's done in universities out to a wider audience. And I have to say, I've been thinking a lot about knowledge mobilization generally because we're doing a book, I'm publishing a book, the evolution of evidence-based policymaking in Canada. in which academics who also have had a previous experience in policymaking have been writing about their experience, have done these essays that came out of a workshop. And it turns out, from their point of view, it's not just a matter of publishing evidence and then government takes that evidence and makes correct decisions. Apparently it doesn't always happen that way, but there's a fairly complicated route. And as a publisher, I'm in that route. And I've been thinking a lot about how it doesn't always work as well as it should. And I guess that's another story, but I'm always interested in authors' experiences with publishers, and if the book that they thought they were writing, if it's come out of the process looking like that book that they thought. And I'm not sure everybody would say it has worked that way, and sometimes the experiences have gone well and sometimes they haven't. So I'm always interested in those stories. But along with the common ancestor of the very short introduction series, we decided to have an offshoot in Canada, which is, we call it the Issues in Canada series. So we've had academics write books on either problems or things that happen, like racism in Canada, substance abuse in Canada, crime in Canada. Nice short books just like this. And the original vision was, give us a snapshot of what this particular issue looks like. Give us the demographics, give us a little bit of history, give us what the policy options are. Tell us how you think it's going to look in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. And what we're particularly interested in at the time of coming up with this idea was, what are the fracture lines of debates? Where do the experts, the academics, where do they not agree? And this gets us back to knowledge mobilization in the sense, what I found was there's not as much disagreement as we thought. The information is there, it's public, but it's not always available, and it doesn't always travel. And I would say a lot of these books have gone back into universities. So they've become our Issues in Canada series have become textbooks much more than we expected them to be. And that's great. I'm delighted for that. But we had also wanted them to go out much more into the general trade than they have done. And they're trickling out slowly. And we've tried social media. We've tried various different things. And there's some things publishers are good at and some things publishers are not so good at, and perhaps social media is one of those things that we're not so good at, but hopefully we'll learn. But what I have found is one of the biggest successes has been a little history of Canada. So although it's not in our Issues in Canada series, it has this common ancestor. And this book has been really, really successful. This book, when people in my office want to know something about Canadian history, they have this on their desk and they check. And it's incredible. I look things up in it. It's a really good resource. And I think it's been that switch that publishers have been going through, is what we might call a bite-sized approach, or a more reader-orientated approach than the big monograph. So to me, this is one of the biggest success stories. I would say Professor Nelles is a really good writer, an exceptionally good writer, and he thinks a lot about how he's going to tell a story, which is something it's always a really, really good place to start when you're approaching a publisher. So just very briefly, I'm just going to talk through how manuscripts look, how this whole process looks to a publisher. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And it'll be different for all publishers, but it won't be that different. Like, we'll all have a similar process. So somebody comes to me with a proposal, and the first very obvious question is this a good fit for Oxford or whatever publisher? And a lot of the time it's not, and a lot of the time we advise where else that they would go with it. But if it does look like it could be a good fit, then it starts going through this pipeline, and there are various questions that are put forward. First of all, the main one would be, who's going to buy it? How many people are going to buy it? How many units? All those financial questions. And we would typically go back to the author and say, who do you think would buy this book? And the author would come up with these glorious numbers of the millions of people who are going to be lining up to buy it, which we take with a grain of salt. So then there are internal questions, because I then have to come up with an argument as an acquisitions editor where I convince a larger editorial board that it's not just that I've been charmed by a sweet-talking author who can write a nice sentence. It's that there really is a package here. There's a vision, there's new research, there's questions being answered. It fits with our mandate that it's new research, and it's going to be pushing the boundaries, and it's going to be opening minds. So I have to put that together, make that argument. It goes to a separate body. They look it over, they come up with some numbers, and then they'll usually come back to me and say, no, forget it. But try again, because it might work. So then I would go back to the author, and we would go back and forth. And that's where it starts to look a lot less like the author's original vision. It starts to look a lot less like my original vision. And it starts to look like something different. And I'm always amazed by how the book that comes out of this process is really not like what's gone in. It's usually a pretty different sort of entity that comes out. And once we have that manuscript, then we have to have that independently reviewed. So we need to get readers' reports. And I'm sure everybody's had experience with independent reports, and I'm happy to take any questions about how that looks too. But we're just as cynical as most authors would be about it, but I think it does have its virtues. Once that's done, we then send a report to a larger editorial body in the UK called the Delegate Board, and they make the final decision. And it's only at the point where they look over all the material, they look at the reports, and they say, okay, this looks like a good book. Then it's kind of official, and it goes into the pipeline and comes out again. So I would say, in terms of knowledge mobilization, I think the publisher's role with digitization is really changing, and I think publishers aren't quite sure where it's going, but we're within this way of shaping information, where it goes through and it gets altered in the process. But what comes out are these successes sometimes. So there we are.
Thank you very much, Viv and Jennie, and indeed all our panelists. And I'd like now to open the floor to questions. If there are thematic questions related to the entire panel or individual questions to a set of our presenters.
And moving towards mobilization in unexpected ways, in less traditional ways. What was the biggest surprise you encountered?
Positive or negative?
Well, for me, it was a surprise at what a pleasure it was. You pile up the page a day. You get a sense of accomplishment. I think there may be a sense in an academic career that this is sort of offline stuff. I mean, this is kind of, you're wasting your time. You're doing, but I actually found it to be, first of all, very enjoyable and intellectually very satisfying. There are real puzzles in taking what you know and translating it in that way. So I would say that the surprise is the pleasure of the challenge.
I'm going to echo that in the sense of the pleasure, absolutely, the new relationship that's been built, but the ease that it happened in. Part of me was thinking, oh no, I'm being given another job amongst, the dozen that I already have. But it really didn't turn into that. It's like a real investment in what we're doing in our board. So it's been the ease of it and then the benefits of it. So I was really quite surprised that it flowed so smoothly and it was so beneficial.
As we still often go by binary oppositions, I'm going to say something negative, a negative surprise, which was the students' expectations. Some students' expectations are extremely traditional. And they want a very well structured curriculum with this kind of linear progression. If we propose something else, they feel kind of disoriented. They don't know what's going around. They are probably concerned about their grades. Because oftentimes, and that is my experience, I try to do some innovations in my other courses. It happens to be 4-year and master's seminars, so students are already accustomed to some kind of working at the university. And oftentimes they are very good students. I would even say that weak students are more open to this different kind of experience because they have nothing to lose in a sense. And they want to try, they want to risk. And I am this time positively surprised that those students that we perceive as weak do very well in this different organization of courses, this learning object, granulated units, creativity, active approach to learning, rather than write another dissertation, 3-part dissertation that they know how to do, and I don't get a feeling that they really are pushed to reflect about their learning process and about themselves, who they are, where they want to go, what they know to do, not know, but to do, and so on.
Well, I don't know if this is necessarily negative. I think I would say there are a couple of aspects that are surprising. One is that I think it's been surprising to see in a community that traditionally, an immigrant community traditionally, that has not placed a lot of emphasis on the humanities, that I'm starting now to see a lot of interest in issues around communication and social sciences. And so I think that has been very surprising but beneficial, that now I can go into rooms of people who might conventionally be interested in going to engineering or computer science or medicine, and they are interested now in hearing about some of these issues. So I think that is great. And on the flip side, I think I see the same thing when I go into the classroom, and when you talk about some of these issues, I can see that there's relevance there for a lot of the students, that they understand what I'm talking about. But I think what I would say, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but I think that Danielle talked about who is allowed to speak and representation, and I think one of the things that I found challenging, and I still don't really know what the right way is to deal with it, is that you can find things like sexism and racism in the academy, but when you find it in community work, I think it's very challenging to know how you deal with it. And so the set of knowledges you would bring in the academy are not necessarily going to help you here if you want to be seen as a trusted and respected partner. And I think that's still a challenge that maybe surprising is not the right word, but sometimes it is. I think sometimes I'm surprised by the things that people are willing to say about traditional roles and whether or not a woman belongs in the room and things like that. And I think that is one area where it shows that the desperate need to bring some of these knowledges, but then also shows that there's a real challenge and maybe a gap in terms of understanding how best to relate that to that audience.
My sense is that our conversation is going to continue over lunch, so I will invite us to thank our panelists and to enjoy our lunchtime meeting.